and I'll cover this at the end. But at the end of the session, we'll send you all a survey, and we're really keen to hear your feedback, both on today's session, but also to hear about any ideas you have about specific topics you'd like us to cover in future sessions. We're going to cover quite a lot today, but there's an awful lot more work going on within the programme that we won't have a chance to cover today, so there might be things that pique your interest. Okay, and as I said, we've got a fantastic range of presentations for you today from people who are working right across the programme. Over the last year, we've made significant progress in developing the Digital Identity Service. Working with our development partner, Scott Logic, we've been building the core elements of that service. And you're going to hear more about the components of the service, our approach to privacy and security, how we're involving users in the development work, and how we plan to support public sector organisations who will use this service. We're also very excited to be able to show you a demo of one or two of the components. But before we delve into some of the detail, I'd just like to say a few words to introduce the Digital Identity Service. The overall strategic aim of the service is to provide people with a safe, secure, and easy way to access public services and to prove they are eligible for a public service or benefit online. Our vision is to save time for people and reduce the need to repeatedly enter information and undertake verification checks every time they want to access a service. We also want people to trust and have confidence in the service, that it is safe and secure, and that their personal information will be kept private. Users will have complete control about what data is stored and what data is shared. And we're aligning our service to a range of security and privacy standards, which Laurie will tell you more about later. Giving people a choice about what they want to access and when is another key principle of the service. We are taking an inclusive approach that recognises not everyone can or wants to use a digital route to access public services. So we are committed to ensuring offline routes continue to be available. There are also benefits to the public sector too. By delivering a consistent approach to identity, more services can be put safely online while reducing cost and helping to minimise fraud. The commitment to deliver a digital identity service for the public sector featured most recently in our digital strategy, which was published last year. This strategy, which is named in the first bullet on the slide, is a joint strategy with local government and includes actions to build a suite of common components to be adopted across the public sector, thus helping to transform government. Through this strategy, the Scottish Government is creating critical infrastructure underpinned by a shared vision of a modern, digital and collaborative government designed around people. We are taking a standards-based approach. This includes the Scottish approach to service design, which puts users at the centre of what we develop. Our user research programme, which you will hear more about from Steph, influences our development through ongoing research and testing with users. The development of common components to be used across the public sector will allow efficiency savings by reducing duplication and encouraging further digital transformation in the delivery of public services. And finally, we're taking an ethical approach, making sure that we are building and developing trust in the way we use data and apply digital technology, making sure that we protect personal privacy and empower people to be informed users and to control their personal information. As part of that approach, we're working with an organisation called Britain Thinks to undertake a public engagement project, which is seeking people's views on risks, benefits and trade-offs. All of this helping to shape an inclusive service fit for the user. So I've already mentioned we're developing a number of key components to the Digital Identity Service, and you'll hear more about these from Francis and Neil shortly. But briefly, these are a secure sign-on, which will allow people to use the same account to securely log into a variety of services, thus making access to online public services easier and simpler. An identity verification process for when a public service needs to confirm identity or other personal information. And we're also developing a personal and secure attribute locker. This is a place where people can choose to store verified information about themselves, such as an identity or address, or that they are eligible for a specific benefit. This would be stored in an individual locker that would be under the user's complete control. They could then choose to reuse that information by sharing it securely with other public services to prove their eligibility. As I said earlier, we are developing this service for use across the public sector in Scotland. An important element of our work is therefore working with organisations that could potentially use the service. We refer to these organisations as service customers. Our engagement has identified a number of strategic opportunities across the public sector, in particular with Disclosure Scotland, the Digital Front Door Health Programme and Social Security Scotland, and there are many other organisations who are interested too. We are delighted that Disclosure Scotland is working in partnership with us as our first service customer to develop, shape and adopt the service. This is so they can deliver their digital disclosure checks, a key legislative requirement under the Disclosure Scotland Act. And as you can see from the quote from Kenny, Disclosure Scotland share our ambition for the Digital Identity Service and recognise the benefits of collaboration in achieving those aims. I hope that gives you a flavour of our vision for the Digital Identity Service and has provided an introduction to the work that we're doing to deliver that vision. I will now hand over to Laurie Brown, who is our Digital Information Security Lead on the programme, to give you an overview of our security and privacy principles. Thank you. Over to you, Laurie.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine, and it's nice that security is actually coming in at the beginning of a project rather than the end. So thank you everyone. Hi, I'm Laurie, Digital Information Security Officer at Scottish Government. I look after a number of digital public services. The Digital Identity Programme is one of them. And I'm going to talk to you today briefly about how I've approached the whole security assurance journey for the programme so far. I have one slide, so I'm not going to give you death by PowerPoint here, and I'm going to talk about this most valuable design concept. So the first thing I want to talk about, which will be close to a lot of people's hearts on this call today, is how we are approaching privacy by design and by default. Now, privacy has always been one of the fundamental principles for the service. I've been at previous events and spoken about our approach to privacy. It's important. Why? Well, because it's UK GDPR, so it's the law, but through our user research over all these years, in order for us to gain and retain trust in the service we're building, we need to be completely open and transparent about how we are approaching privacy. And we're able to demonstrate that to everybody who looks to use the service. Now, as the service has evolved, as I say, it's always been at the heart of our design and build process, and it's integral in everything we do. So we do have a team of privacy experts and privacy specialists on the programme, and they are constantly challenging the lawfulness, the justification, the necessity, the proportionality of everything we do, so that we're constantly asking ourselves, from a privacy perspective, is this the right thing? I'm going to get quite technical at points in this chat. I apologise in advance. Now, one of the mechanisms that we're using to demonstrate how we are meeting this principle is through documentation against a number of standards. So the main one here is a standard from the ISO IEC, which is 27701, which is a privacy bolt-on standard to the security standard ISO 27001, which I'll come to talk about in a second. And it's worth flagging that ISO 27701 is one of the key drivers in the UK government's trust framework for their identity programme, and we're currently working with them. We're also engaged very closely with the Information Commissioner's Office, and we are right now completing our accountability self-assessment against the ICO's accountability framework. And that all these things will be made available to anyone who has an interest to read them. The second principle I'm pushing for is security by design and by default. Another one of these, the three fundamental principles that drives everything I do. I have to stress it's not just for the identity program, for every program that I'm overseeing. This is my second key principle. We are constantly revising the threat models and our risk assessing the service as it evolves and matures, so that we are maintaining visibility of the threat landscape and any security countermeasures that we feel are justifiably required. Similar to our privacy by design and default principle, we do recognise that trust can easily be lost through poor cyber security and cyber resilience measures. So like the privacy principle, we're aligning to a range of security standards to demonstrate how we are approaching security for the programme. So we have the Scottish Government Cyber Resilience Framework, which takes parts of the ISO 27001 standard. It takes things from the NIST regulations, which is the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Assessment Framework. We are completing the Cloud Security Alliance's Cloud Controls Matrix, the CCM, and considering publishing the results of that through the CSA STAR programme. We are also, just with the standards in place, just to say that we're hoping that we'll be publishing as much of that as we can, just to demonstrate, again, for those that understand the technical aspect of this, how we are approaching the cyber security programme. The third one, there around desirability, it's titled that visible, transparent and user-centered. I'll probably say this is usability by default and design. And this is about ensuring that the service is doing what it says on the tin. It's working the way we expect it to work. All the security measures and the privacy measures that we've put in place are actually working effectively and efficiently, and we're not degrading the user experience in any unacceptable ways. For example, mandating a 500 character password, which would just be ridiculous. This is actually probably the hardest principle to achieve, because as you hear from user research teams and others, there's always a balance between security and usability. And I'll give you an example. So when you take a high value application like digital identity, the OWASP standard. Now, OWASP is a not-for-profit community organisation of application security standards. They say that if you don't use the session that you're in while you're working away within about 2 minutes, then you should be timed out and you would have to log back in again to resume your session. Now, the WCAG, which is the accessibility standards that we adhere to, actually suggests that you should have 20 hours of inactivity before you are timed out. So there's a clear balance between high security and accessibility and usability. Now, we actually rely extremely heavily on our user research, and that helps us to determine the optimum settings for the services. So yes, a session expiry of 2 minutes would cause significant disruption to even to myself trying to use the service, but 20 hours would leave people exposed to cyber and privacy risks and cyber attacks. If, for example, if you're in a community space like a library and you forget to log off, the next person who comes onto that workstation would have access, in theory, to your service. So you do need to find a balance. But keeping the interests of our service end users is uppermost, and we are challenging our security and privacy baselines constantly. And just making sure that we're not overly disrupting the usability by default and design approach. So that's pretty much me. Just in conclusion, across these 3 principles today, and I'm going to publish a series of blogs, which will go into a little bit more detail about each of these, which you're welcome to follow. Just to stress that security's work isn't going to stop once the service is live. We're going to continuously be looking to improve ways of working. We'll be closely monitoring emerging technologies, so things like passwordless or homomorphic encryption, and we'll see if they can help bring value to the service as it matures into the future. So I'll be around the programme for quite some time. That is all from me, Trudy.
Good afternoon. Glad you're able to join us. My name is Frances Zinedi. I'm the Senior Delivery Manager for the Digital Identity Service. I'm going to give an update on the secure sign-on component of the service. Joe, if you can maybe move on, I think, to the next slide. So yeah, the secure sign-on component, which has been designed to make accessing online public services easier and simpler by using one account to securely sign into a variety of services. Maybe move on. So before we get on to the demo, I'll give a summary of the key features of Secure Sign-On. Firstly, account creation. This allows the user to sign up for an account, and this is done using two-factor authentication, email and mobile. Next, we have account sign-in, which allows a user to sign in to their existing digital identity account. And again, sign-in is done with two-factor authentication, email and mobile. It's important to point out that in terms of authentication, Secure Sign-On has been built with the capabilities and level of security of Good Practice Guide or GPG 44 medium level. And this is needed to support future scope of the digital identity service. Finally, the next feature is account reset and recovery, and that enables the user to recover their account if they have forgotten their mobile number, their password or email. And for all of these features, there's error handling, as you'd expect to support the user sign up, sign in and recover their account. In terms of accessibility, we've developed Secure Sign-On to meet the Digital Scotland Design System standards, and we've met the Scottish Government's accessibility standards. And this has been done through accessibility testing and also testing through user research. We're continuing to refine our end user support, and we'll gather feedback from users and act upon that feedback. And of course, our service has been designed to be fully mobile responsive. In terms of analytics and service management, we have implemented a basic analytics using Google Analytics, which we will continue to evolve. And we've designed an incident management structure that sits around Secure Sign-On, and we've release and deployment processes in place that will allow us to deploy improvements as we iterate. Next is a short demo.
Welcome to the Digital Identity Service. What you will see today is a demo in a live environment of someone creating an account for the first time. Based on user feedback and research, images, logos, text, and some steps might change, all part of creating a great service for users. Today's demo is of the desktop journey. The desktop journey is easier to show you, but by using responsive design, the Digital Identity Service will work just as well on a tablet or mobile phone. The Digital Identity Service will provide access to many different Scottish public services. A prompt to sign in or create an account can appear on any website. The user will click the link and start the process. Creating an account is quick, simple, and secure. The user begins by learning more about the Digital Identity Service and how it will benefit them. We then let them know what they will need to set up an account for the first time. Users enter their email address and create a strong password. Throughout the process, as you can see here, we offer additional help to support users if they need it. Before they're able to progress, they'll be asked to agree to our privacy notice and terms and conditions. and just in case someone remembers that they already have an account and they want to use it, there is a link to navigate to the sign-in screen instead. Users will then need to click a link sent to their email to check they have access and to prove they wanted to use this email address. If they already have an account, this will be flagged to the user. They can also request the email again if they deleted it by accident, or correct their email address at this point. A mobile phone number is required for two-factor authentication. Every time someone signs in, they will receive a code to authenticate access. We are looking at adding other ways to authenticate access in the future. We will also offer people the opportunity to stop the process here if they wish to. Choice and control is always given to the user. If they decide to stop at this stage, all information is removed from our system. If someone was on a mobile phone that supports entering a code without copying and pasting, they'll be able to use this, a small quality of life feature to support users. The process is now complete. The user has an account. They will now be able to use it to log on to any service that uses the digital identity service. The final demo screen you see is about verifying identity. This is just for demo purposes. If the user doesn't need to verify their identity, then they'll move back to the service they started from or continue on another journey. This can be tailored to different user journeys for different services. Thank you for watching. Welcome.
That gives a demo of our secure sign-on sign-up process. I'll just finish up with some information about the infrastructure for the service. We're iterating on the Scottish Government's shared cloud platform, and this means that we're able to reuse the existing work on security, release and operations. We've multiple environments available to support development, assurance and service customer testing and integration. We deployed Secure Sign-On into our production environment at the start of October, and it's now available for service customer integration and exploration. Future developments for Secure Sign-On it will really focus on additional authenticators, service customer onboarding and continuous improvement. That's me. I'll hand over to Neil.
Good afternoon. I'm Neil Duggan. I'm the product manager for digital identity. So I'm responsible for the quality of what we're building, making sure we're putting in place the right thing. I'm going to talk about the verify your identity component of our service. If you could just flick on there, Joseph, thanks. This is the second of the components we're building and is discrete, so you can have sign-on without needing to verify your identity. So I'll just give you a little bit of high level of what it is. We'll show the demo and then talk a bit more in detail about it afterwards. So verify your identity is specifically for public services that need to check somebody's identity. Services will need to do that before they show users personal information about themselves, so they make sure that they are showing the information to the person who it belongs to. They're not accidentally giving it out to somebody else. And also before you give the user something. So if you're about to pay out money or any other form of benefit. So for our service, when we're talking about identity verification, there's really two components to that. If you just flick on to the next one, please, Joseph. There's checking that a person with those details exists. So when somebody comes and says, this is my name in an online service and my address and so on, checking that there is actually evidence of that person being in the real world, that it's not completely made up identity. And the second component is that checking the person that you're dealing with is actually that person as well. Some of these things are quite hard to do online. There's additional checks we need to do to make sure we have this level of confidence. But they're very important to making sure that people's information is safe, that we are only giving access to people who should be getting access to services, but also so that you can trust that your information is safe with us as well, that we're not giving it out to anybody. I think we'll just have the demo just now, Joe, and then we'll talk a bit more in detail after.
Welcome to the Digital Identity Service sign-in and identity verification demo. This is in a pre-deployment environment. The images, logos, words, and steps may change as we look to enhance the experience for end users. Signing in is simple. After clicking the link on the service website, the user is redirected to our server and begins by entering their email address and password. They will then be asked to authenticate their access. In this version, we have implemented authentication by mobile phone text messages. In the future, we are looking at other ways to authenticate access. The digital identity system is available to services who don't need identity verification. And at this point, they can continue on the journey if that step is not required. Today, we want to show you the identity verification process as well. We start by making it clear to people what they will need to complete their identity verification. In this release, this is a check against their photo ID document. In the future, other ways to verify identity will be introduced as well. It's at this stage our identity verification partners and Experian are involved in the background. They are checking and validating the information. The identity and verification step look to be part of the same common user journey within the digital identity service. We begin by asking for information required for identity and verification purposes. This is the user's forenames and last names and their date of birth. To make the journey easier for users and the identity verification process, we offer the opportunity to use an address lookup. If the address isn't quite right, then the user can always enter it manually. Users are asked to take a photo of their document and their face. This is easy to do on a mobile phone, so we encourage people to move to a mobile device at this point, but it is always optional. Other ways to complete an identity verification check will be added in the future. Here, a QR code is used to pass the journey onto a mobile phone. Other options may be available in the future. There is no need for the user to sign in again. If the user is already on a mobile device, this page won't appear. People choose the document type they wish to use. Biometric residence permits are often held by international people working or living in the UK. Today, we will use a passport. The process is the same for all document types. Instructions are provided about what will happen next to explain the process. The user gives permission for the service to access the camera and then lines up the document to the camera. Once aligned, the photo is taken automatically. The user checks the photo is clear. If it isn't, they can try again. Now we check the photo and the document matches the person who is holding it. Instructions are provided to support users. The user lines up their face, and again the system takes the photo automatically. The user checks the photo is clear. If it isn't, they can retake the photo. It's at this stage Experian completes the identity check. Time to do this can vary, but typically it takes seconds. If a user needs to wait because a manual check is needed, for example, an email will be sent to them once it has been completed. The Digital Identity Service has now received the necessary information to say that identity has been verified, and the user can now share this with service providers. We will soon adding other ways for people to reuse an existing check so they don't need to do this more than once. Thanks for watching, and please get in touch to hear more about our latest developments.
So we're going to need to take Joe's word for it that the photos were acceptable there, because he's obviously blurred them out to protect his identity. A couple of things just to maybe emphasise as well. We do not want services to be asking for any more information than they need to be about users. So the identity verification process is only for those two circumstances where somebody is wanting access to existing personal information, or where somebody is about to receive some form of benefit and payment or otherwise. Generally, I would say the data minimization is a very important principle that we're working with across the service, in that people should not be asking for or transferring more information about users than they absolutely need. So we've tried to build that in the principles across the piece. So just to the slide here, the main aims we have with Verify Your Identity are really kind of removing inconsistencies and making sure that people only have to do something once. So different services across kind of the public sector are currently doing verification in quite a different variety of ways. There's sometimes good reasons for that. It's sometimes just been as appropriate to their service. But what we're hoping to do is provide a consistent way that meets the good practice guide standards for medium confidence that means it can be reused across services. The GPG 45 mentioned there is the good practice guidance. 44 is the standard for authentication, so that's the standards we're meeting for sign-in. 45 is the identity verification standard. And what that specifies are things like what is suitable evidence and what is acceptable evidence of somebody being a person, that particular person, what kind of checks we have to do to make sure it's not somebody impersonating them, and what we need to do to have confidence that in all the facts round about them before we can say that is that person. We did quite a bit of work talking to other organisations about the level of identity verification checks before we settled on that one. It's a balance between a decent level of confidence for organisations knowing who they're dealing with without being too onerous on the users for providing the details of evidence. You'll have seen across the service there, we're using the Scottish design system again, so the components are consistent across. Most of what's in the design system has already been heavily tested to make sure it meets accessibility standards, but we're doing further accessibility reviews and quite a wide range of usability testing as part of our user research to make sure that we're as good a standard as we can be across the board there. And the other thing about the removing inconsistencies is by doing all the above, we hope that this will be easier to reuse, easier to fit within public services, and there will be that trust across services that the standard we have used for the verification is good enough for everybody else's purposes. And that will allow us to just verify somebody once. The user will only need to do this at one point. We will allow them to save in the locker that we're mentioning later. And then with the user's consent, that can be shared with other services when necessary to say that I've already proven who I am, you don't need to go through these steps again. That's also the reason why we have the multi-factor authentication on the sign-in. So the sign-in is confidence that it's the same user coming back. The verification is the confidence in who that user is if it's necessary for that service. Could we flick on to, yeah. So just on the slightly more technical side, apologies to anybody who's not particularly interested in this, but this is just a brief overview of what kind of information we send back to a service customer, so the service that you're coming from about that identity verification. We've tried to apply data minimization. So say, for example, you use your passport. We are not sending back a photo of the passport. We're not sending back the passport number or any more of the other details on that. We use the image of that document while we are doing the identity verification, and then what we send back to the service customers is we have done verification to a particular standard, in this case the GPG 45 medium, and the person has that name, that date of birth and that address. The outputs we're looking at, I think there's probably going to be some development in this, there's probably going to be some changes, but we're looking at different standards that are used across various organisations. We've been looking at the Open Identity Exchange work. We've been speaking to the Government Digital Service about compatibility. So just generally making sure we have something that is reusable as widely as possible and compatible with whatever we need it to. And the point we're at in the implementation at the moment is that was kind of an early version of the verifying your identity. We will be adding the ability to save that in the locker, and there's future kind of content changes and updates to come on there as well. And then just one last slide on the verifying identity. So the initial release does require photographic identification. So your passport, your driving license, or the biometric residence permit. That is a limitation, and we are aware that that is not going to be suitable for everybody. So that is just very much the first version, so that we can get it up and running. We can understand how it works for people in practice. We can check things are stable and running well. It's very important to us that we add alternate methods of people being able to verify their identity, so they don't need to have photo ID, so we're not excluding people from the service. One of the ways we will do that is knowledge-based verification, so where you're answering questions that only you should know the answer to, a range of questions and getting through that. We will add additional forms of identity, photo ID that can be used for the service. But longer term, there's some other things that we think are preferable. So if we can move to the use of government data for knowledge-based verification, that removes the dependence on external partners. So we would like to have kind of more of the just in-house information used for that purpose, and vouching as well. So there are various groups of individuals who don't have identification. They might not have stable home addresses, so they can't prove kind of a long-standing history. They might have VIN credit files, so there's nothing there to check on it. In situations like that, vouching from a professional or somebody who knows them will make sure that we can have like much more open access to the service than would be the case otherwise. I think that's probably more than enough on identity verification just now, so I'm going to hand over to Steph to tell us about user research.
Thanks, Neil. I think everybody's pretty much given user research a shout out throughout the presentation, so no pressure for me. Just to say, I'm Steph, one of the user researchers in the programme. I'm the lead user researcher and one of many user-centred design disciplines. So there's not just user research, we also have service design, content design, interaction designers, and we make up that whole user-centred design team. So in terms of user research, I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about what it is, what we're kind of doing in the programme, what we've learned, and show some design iterations based on the user research findings. So for those, I'm sure there's probably lots of people that are familiar with user research, but for anyone who isn't, user research is about working with teams to understand who the users are, where they are, what they're trying to achieve, and what they need to do that. So we're responsible for providing user insights to support evidence-based decisions within the team. And we're also responsible for advocating for user needs to ensure the services that we are designing are as inclusive and accessible as possible, meaning that anyone who needs to use the service can use it. And you'll see there, we're technically the people in the middle, bridging the gap between the users and people making decisions. We also work in an agile environment within that multidisciplinary team. And again, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the agile process. There's numerous design life cycles from discovery, alpha, beta, live through to continuous improvement. And this just means that we're learning and developing the designs iteratively throughout the process, and user research is involved throughout all of those stages. And we're constantly looking at user needs, and once we gather user needs through any of those stages, then we're continuously reviewing whether those user needs are still valid, or if new ones have come out, or they're no longer a user need. So Laurie also mentioned about security being involved once the service is live through continuous improvement, and that's the same for research, because we want to make sure what we have actually designed and delivered is meeting user needs and is working as it expected and should be for the users. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we've actually spoken to within the programme. There's a diverse range of users that's been involved in the research that we've carried out. We've spoken to people in rural areas, for example, people with low digital skills, people with different disabilities. This is just a kind of sample just to give a flavour of different people that we have spoken to. Throughout the research, we aim to include a diverse range of users in each round of research, making sure that we're covering as much demographic as possible. And I think over the last year, we've spoken to around over 80 people, and that's also in addition to the public engagement work that you've heard be mentioned as well. We use various different research methods. So you'll see on the screen there, we've got things from interviews, and you've heard the team mention about usability testing, accessibility testing, etc. And we can do this through remote channels. Like everyone else, we've been doing a lot of that remotely throughout the last almost 3 years are we coming up to now, but more recently we've actually been back to face-to-face research, so it's been really good to see different users in real life, and we had done some accessibility testing. You've heard Neil mention accessibility audits, but we also were doing accessibility testing with real users that would be using the service, and we tested the secure sign-on component with people that are assistive technology users, so using screen readers and screen magnification, just to ensure that that component is inclusive and accessible and people can use it and get through the tasks that they need to do. We've also been working with Disclosure Scotland more recently, doing further face-to-face research, working collaboratively with them as the first service customer to understand how the service will fit in with their users, and looking at it from Disclosure Service from a user journey perspective, moving from disclosure to the digital identity. service, and that at the moment something that we've done just recently, working our way through the analysis and findings for that. So after research has been carried out, appreciate this is like a really whistle-stop tour, and I don't have enough time to cover everything, but just high level, once the research has been carried out, we do the analysis and we present research findings to the team and any other teams that the findings may be relevant to. And we also translate insights from research into something called user needs. And user needs are the needs essentially that a user has of a service, and which that service, whether that's ours or anyone else, must satisfy for the user to get the right outcome for them. And I'll show you a couple of examples in a moment, but we also have a process to ensure that we turn research insights into action, so that we're actually doing the research and making a difference and an impact. So we meet as a multidisciplinary team to discuss the research findings and agree any actions or solutions that we might want to take based on the research. So here we've got some sample of content and design iterations. I think I've maybe got 4 or 5 of them, just to talk through how the research has impacted the work and the designs that you've seen there on the demonstrations, where a user is creating an account, signing in, or going through that identity verification process. So here we have at the very top, this is the user needs that I was referring to. We have a user need here around I need to know upfront what an acceptable selfie looks like, so that I can ensure I am in a suitable environment. And iteration 1 on the left-hand side, you can see there it has scan your face, and it's pretty bare, just basically has a picture of the phone and a continue button. So then the second iteration had a little bit more detail and information about the environment that someone needs to be in, whether that's well lit, in front of a plain background, so you can see that there's further content there, and a green banner that your ID has been uploaded. And on the next screen, this is one that I've got 4 iterations for. We've kind of been doing different research and testing and changing this kind of numerous times to get to where it is today. We also then have, we need you to take a selfie, and you'll note that the language has also changed. It previously had scan your face, so I'll touch on that in a moment. And it had the description of where someone should be at the bottom there in the bullet points. But then we were finding that that was kind of information overload, and we've reduced it on the right-hand side there, iteration 4, to just the kind of key pieces that people need to know about wearing glasses, etc. And you'll see just where that arrow is on the right-hand side. We were previously referring to this as a selfie, but we'd found from the user research that people thought that wasn't perhaps the most professional language and terminology. So we now have take a picture of your face, which seems to be testing pretty well. So that's two different user needs for that one. Here we have albeit we've got the old version of the language here, selfie, on the screen, but this is around, as a user, I need to know why I'm being asked to smile when taking a selfie, so that I'm not left confused, as this isn't in line with my expectations from other government services. So you'll see at the bottom in the yellow highlights, but we have instructions to say that people would be asked to smile when taking their selfie, and that was really kind of off-putting, surprising to people, and users didn't understand why, because they're, comparing us to Passport Office, for example, where that's not in line with other government services. So it was a surprise to them, so it was confusing people, and people weren't smiling, or they said they wouldn't, or they would be laughing, etc. So we've actually turned off the smile trigger. So when you have your face in the oval for a picture of your face, then you wouldn't necessarily be told to smile anymore. This one has come from the accessibility testing that I was referring to, where we had tested it with assistive technology users. So this was specific to screen reader users. As a screen reader user, I need call to action buttons to appear straight after input fields, so that I'm not lost in unexpected content while trying to progress to the next screen. And basically what was happening here is on the left-hand side with the iteration 1, when a user was putting in the email and password and then agreeing to the 2 boxes at the bottom, you'll see just under that there is the sign-in option if you already have an account that was in the demo earlier. But for screen reader users, for anyone that's not familiar, they basically read out all of the content on the screen, and when the screen reader user was going down to tick the 2 boxes and they were going to the tab or whatever button to move to the next part of the screen, it was going straight to sign in, and as soon as that was being read out, then users were hitting enter. The screen reader hadn't had a chance to read out the rest of that sentence, so it was confusing and taking the users through to the sign-in loop, but they obviously haven't created their account at this point. So you see on the right-hand side, the continue button has been moved up. So that's directly after the last thing that the user will be agreeing to, and the sign-in, if you already have an account, has been moved to just below that to avoid any confusion. And what else do we have? This is around the identity documents that people will be using to prove verify their identity, and as a user I need to know whether my photo ID needs to be in date so I can verify my identity without unnecessary delays to the process. So this has come up in numerous rounds of research, and people weren't sure if they could use something that has expired or wasn't, an old passport, etc. So on the right hand side there, we've added in another sentence that just mentions that the photo ID must be valid and must not have passed its expiry date. And on the same subject, this one is around a provisional driving licence as opposed to full licences. We found in research that was coming up that people were asking whether they could use a provisional driving licence or whether that had to be a full one. So again, based on that user need, we've just added a little bit of content there on the light grey on the right hand side where that arrow is, just so that people aren't confused and they know what exactly that they can use when they're going through the process. So that's just a very small sample of design iterations and different things that we have. There's lots of user research going on. We don't have enough time because we were only allocated a short period of time, so I could go on and on about all the research and what we've learned and what we're doing. But what's coming up next in the future, just to give a rough idea for people, you've heard Neil mentioning this and others about other methods of authentication when signing into an account. So you've seen when someone has to put in their phone number and they get the one-time passcode and put that in. So we're looking at other methods of authentication for that. We'll have further usability and accessibility testing, though I'm sure there'll be plenty more rounds of that. And we're also looking at branding for government services in terms of logos, etc. And then we'll also be looking at the locker functionality. We would be doing a bit of testing on the prototypes for that. We have already done some work on it before and have an understanding of some high-level basic user needs for that. And we'll be looking at delegation and proxy users, so if someone is using our services on behalf of someone else. And again, as I've already touched on, continuous improvement plans. So once it goes live with a service customer, then we'll be looking to get those insights for continuous improvement to feed it in and understand what's working and what could maybe be improved. So thanks, that is me, and it's back to you now.
Super, thanks, Steph. The user research is incredibly important to kind of like everything we do. It's very easy when you're working on something all the time to make assumptions about how people are going to use their service or understand what the content says. So just that challenge back to make sure that we are building something that works for people is really helpful. So I'm going to talk a bit about the third component now, the locker. So if we just have the next slide, Joe, thanks. What we're calling the locker at the moment is just a place that a user can store verified information about them. So verified information, something that has been provided to a service, that a service has checked and confirmed, and being able to store that themselves and have control over it so that they can then use it if they need to apply to other services. Other services don't need to check it again, which means everybody wins. It's kind of quicker for processing things. It's easier for the service using the information. So on the next slide is just a wee bit of a bit about what kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about attributes and the attribute locker. An attribute is any real item of personal information and metadata with it, so data about the information and assurance information on it. So kind of the assurance information is where did it come from, has an organisation checked it, what kind of level have they checked it, the metadata, so sort of when was it put in, and anything else that needs to be done about it. So if you think back to what we had for the for the verified identity, the personal information in there was your name, your date of birth, and your address. But then the metadata was we've verified it to GPG45 medium. We did it on this date. But attributes can be singular as well. It might just be something as as single as your surname, for example, if that's all you need to share with somebody. And the level of assurance might be different depending on the circumstance. So again, getting to the minimum amount of data that people need to be using for particular things. And attributes can also be derived from other attributes. So in the data minimization, again, rather than sharing your date of birth with a service might just need to know if you're over 18. So they could just ask us, are we over 18? And then we would be able to return a computed answer that says yes or no. And again, that's about meaning that people don't need to be accessing or storing any more information about you than they have to. So the locker journey here is just, it's very straightforward. You apply for something. Once you've done that, any information that's been verified, that service can offer it to you to choose to store in your locker or not, as the case may be. You might decide you don't want to. And you can reuse that information when you're applying for other services. So when you logged into the other service, they would let us know we're interested in these details about that user, and we would ask you if you were okay for sharing them. There is another privacy barrier we have there, that it won't be visible to the service itself whether we didn't have the information or whether you refused to share it. So there's a consent thing there, because the existence of just knowing that somebody has certain items of data in their locker can itself expose personal information. So there's another control on the privacy coming in there as well. If we just click on to the next one, please, Joe. So one of the key things to get right about the locker itself is the data standards. So everybody knows standards are important. Everybody knows that you want to be able to rely on how a piece of information comes across to you, so that you know, for example, that the data is going to be in the UK format and it's not going to be an American date format, and it's not going to cause all sort of problems there. So we're doing a lot of work with Open Identity Exchange to look at kind of what they've been doing on attribute standards, what we can use from that, what we should be consistent with. We're working with colleagues in the UK government about what they're doing and aligning with it on things like address standards, so that if we have to interact, those will be consistent across the piece. But there will always be kind of new things, and we're aware that we are not going to identify the need for every single one of those. They're more likely to come from the service customers, the services themselves, saying that this is the kind of thing, information that we have about a user. We would like to be able to offer that for storage in the locker, because we know that that other service would be able to use it, and it would benefit the user in that way. So just having standards for how we will develop that, how we will keep it moving quickly without causing blockers for other people. We're still at kind of prototyping stage on what the locker would look like. So we have some versions of just those interactions. The storing of the attributes at the end, so just kind of which of these would you like to put. The example there is maybe benefit entitlement, so you can think that what would be useful, and none of these services have agreed to this, so this is a complete kind of theoretical situation I'm talking about here, is if somebody assessed you as being eligible for a benefit, and that benefit entitled you to say kind of blue badges or something from another service, being able to prove that through the locker instead of them having to go to the service and check it, or you having to send in a letter of entitlement, would open things up much more quickly for you. So being able to store that thing in your locker and then being able to share those details on, so that the service doesn't need to check them, they can rely on it because it has that provenance, it has that assurance related to it. So the principles we're using for that, the user must be present and be in control. We don't want kind of ongoing sharing of information when the user isn't there. We want the user to be able to see what's happening. We want the user to be able to, this is just one of the prototypes we have for seeing what you've shared with who and when. So the user can choose to share the detail or not. We will try to make it clear what the benefits are to the user in doing that, but it ultimately is their choice. And the service providers can provide their own references into the locker, so that they can, so that everybody gets the benefit of the work that one part of the public sector does, and we're not repeating things over and over again. There are a few technical requirements for the locker that I'm probably going to gloss over fairly quickly here. the technical terms of zero knowledge, really about that kind of separation of things between there are difficulties in getting to an entirely zero knowledge model because it requires compromises on usability and the user's ability to get access to it again if there's problems. So we're trying to find the right balance at that point on the scale there. There is a lot of focus as a result of that on how we encrypt the data, how the personal data is stored at rest, so it's within an individual locker. It's not one big pile of information that can be searched across. It's isolated to an individual. And again, we have the user as that point of consent and control over things. We do know we're going to need to have flexibility around about how it integrates with things, how it integrates with the other components, and how we transfer the data across the piece. And then just one final quick slide on what's next for it. So we have an external organisation of Voco that we're dealing with to assess the technology options that would support our requirements, those requirements for the locker. And the kind of the technology choice we go down with there, we're in progress with it at the moment, but there's still some things to decide will shape exactly how we deliver and what we do. So there's still technology choice to be made there to meet the kind of requirements we have around about the privacy and security aspects of it. Proof of concept we're hoping to get onto early in the year though, and piloting. So the ideal is that we will do that first of all with the identity attributes. So once you've been through the identity verification process, you'll then be able to store that in a locker for reuse later on. And there'll be more work around about wider ecosystems. So the other attributes from other people. And then at this point, that's when things like the use of delegates, people being able to act on behalf of somebody else, becomes in. So whether that's in a very official capacity, like somebody that has power of attorney for somebody, or whether it's somebody asking somebody on a less formal basis to giving them consent to act on their behalf, there's just making sure that we have ways for users to be able to help with applications and help with interactions with public services, because we know that for some public services it's half of the applications are somebody acting on behalf of somebody else. We know we need to make sure we have that covered. My voice is about to go, so I'm going to hand over to David to talk about the service management now. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks Neil. Yeah, I'm David. I joined the team recently to look at how we design and develop a service management and support function to provide a wraparound around the service to both what we call service customers, so that's the service providers who might use us to verify the user's identity, and also to the users themselves around how they will engage with the service and make sure that it contains the relevant support that's required. If we just move on a slide. Again, digital identity is not just an IT product. I think it's been quite clear as we're describing it as a service. As Neil just mentioned, there will be opportunities in the future that we might have to provide support for people to vouch, or for other ways to confirm their identities, particularly so it can be shared with other service providers. And that's important that we understand what that support looks like, because it won't necessarily all be wholly digital all the time, and maybe handoffs between different processes, and to try and understand how do we resource and recruit those additional processes to ensure that people can engage with the service. Because the greater number of people that can pass through the digital identity service, the fewer additional checks that service providers will have to do at their end, and it's about trying to create that additional value. So in terms of that framework approach, the box on the bottom left hand side is really the bit that we'll talk about today, and that's around the digital and IT support. That is around how do we make sure that the customers that are using us as a plug-in service are provided with a resilient and accessible service, and how our users are able to do that. But it's important to see it through a framework approach. Again, we're framework agnostic in the sense that it's not got any one name, but it at least contains these 7 components to make sure that these are the sort of minimum criteria that we require to run a service. That includes making sure that we're engaging with people around their requirements, that we have appropriate customer accounts and relationships management for those that are using us. We continue to develop the product, and we ensure that it's properly resourced and using external partners where possible, like we've mentioned already, and that, again, particularly working in the public sector environment, that we have the appropriate governance and risk profile in place to make sure that it's well managed and supported. We can move on slightly. Yes, as I just mentioned, there are two main groups that will use the service, what we refer to as our service customers and what we refer to as the users and individuals who will actually have identities within the system. Both have some commonality, and again, both require the system to be there, but there will be different ways that we provide support. Again, for the service customers, they require that supported service within a service to authenticate and verify the service users, so they have to trust that that service will be available and it will actually be performant. And again, we have to work with those customers to understand where the boundaries are between our service and theirs, particularly if people aren't able to use our parts, or if they aren't able to pass through the identity verification. Where does that relationship move on to the service customer to pick them up? Around about the support model, again, is requiring the fact about onboarding, integration, and as Francis mentioned earlier in the call, what is our approach to incident management and reporting around things like service desks, major instance patching, and where there are vulnerabilities exposed in the service, that people have to trust that those will be resolved in a relevant time period. Similarly, users expect that well-connected and well-supported journey, requiring guidance and help to move through the service, as Steph shown. And again, where do we have to look at to provide that additional support for people to complete their journey through having assisted digital channels, or even potentially offline channels in the future, making sure that actually the number of people who can pass through the service has got high success rate as possible. Next slide. We're at the moment where we're looking at the analysis of our current customer relationships and their support requirements in order to set up what is that more traditional IT support desk. But similarly, we're working through what is our release and deployment and configuration management approach. Again, discussing what is the availability and continuity plans in place for the system. And then working through how do we put in place shared service agreements, how do we agree the service levels with our partners, and how do we work out what is the effective reporting and KPI structures to make sure that people are understanding the types of transactions and the volume of transactions that are going through the system in order to work out the volume and the success rates. Over time, we also plan to look at how do we put in place the ability to put in service requests from our customers, actually for new features. Similarly, when we're looking at the support from the public, if we're able to manage the types of requests that are coming in through whether that is providing feedback to us, reporting a problem, or asking for additional help, we'll be able to collate that information and be able to put that into our future pipeline for product improvements to try and reduce those types of help requests coming in the future, particularly the resource intensive manual help where we can try to digitize and automate that where possible. And throughout all of that, we look at the continual service improvement to make sure that we're continually learning and we're continuing evolving, not just at the product level, but also at the service we provide to both our customers and to the users, who are the individuals who will have accounts in the system. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is more of a summary of the last few slides, and it looks at our priorities between now and getting to the beta candidate, which is our pilot environment early in 2023. And that looks at how do we ensure that we've got a robust software development cycle. That's about engaging with our service providers around how frequently they'll expect different software releases to be in place. Again, we're looking at how we do our environments and change release management, making sure that we aren't making changes in environments that are uncontrolled. And again, that's about ensuring that we have those SLAs and service agreements in place with customers to make sure that they understand what changes are happening, how often they expect the system to be updated, and what's our incident management process. Throughout all of that, we're also looking at how we build up our help and knowledge base to make sure that we take feedback throughout all these cycles and to understand how we actually improve the system as it moves through its different phases. And on that, I will pause for a breath and I'll hand over to the next, back to Trudy.
Thank you, David. And indeed, thanks to all of our speakers today for their great presentations. I think hopefully you'll all agree it's a really exciting stage to be at. We have developed the first version of the service and planning to launch that with Disclosure Scotland early next year. And as David mentioned, we're looking ahead to support wider adoption by other public sector services during 2023 and beyond. So I guess this is just a plea and a call to action. If anybody is here today from a Scottish public sector organisation and is looking to use the Digital Identity Service, whether that's just an individual feature like the Secure Sign-On or whether it's the whole service, please get in touch. We'd be delighted to speak to you and talk to you about your requirements, what we might be able to do for you. So please get in touch. The contact details are there. Okay, so today we've talked a lot about the service and the various components, the progress that we've made and the next steps in terms of development. And our approach is, as people have outlined, is to continually improve and develop the service, adding more features and engaging with users as we go at every stage. So a significant part of our work in the coming months and year is to continue building the technology, improving the service and developing it further. But we also have lots more work going on alongside, which we just haven't had time to talk about today. This includes a range of activities that support our commitments to inclusivity, accessibility, security and privacy. And these are things like impact assessments, privacy notices and terms and conditions. And as we develop the various documents and content that supports this, we test that with users along the way to make sure that it contains the right information and it is clear for people to understand. We're also exploring an overall name for the service and the various components of the service. And as I mentioned earlier, we are currently undertaking a public engagement campaign to seek views from the public and to understand public perceptions of the risks, benefits and trade-offs of the Digital Identity Service. And all of that work will hopefully report early in the new year. So we now move on to the Q&A, and I hope that the Q&A has now gone live and people can ask questions and post their questions on the Q&A. The team will be busy working behind the scenes to kind of moderate and collate the questions. So we'll try to answer as many as we can. Obviously, we've got kind of about 45 minutes or so to answer questions. So we'll try to get round as many as we can today. But if we don't get round to them, we'll publish responses after the event. So don't worry if your question's not answered today. Okay, so the first question is, how will you consider the needs of some of the most vulnerable in our society, such as people experiencing homelessness and trying to access vital services and benefits? And I think I'm handing over to Yvonne to answer that one. Is Yvonne there? Silence. We'll go to Susie then, if Susie's...
Sorry, I was just having a few internet issues there.
Oh, there you are, Yvonne. Yvonne, so Yvonne leads she works in our policy team and leads the local government relationship and sponsorship, and also leads all of our work on impact assessments and making sure that we are inclusive and accessible. So Yvonne, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, it's good to hear that kind of question being asked, actually, and it is a key concern of the programme. So we work on impact assessments and consultation with stakeholders. We're looking at non-digital routes, which is part of the service, but also ways that we can look at proxy and vouching for those who don't have traditional identification. So we're happy to hear from people who work in that area and can inform this kind of work, as well as all the engagement that we're doing. So if you can get in touch, that would be great to hear from your particular service experience, particularly when we're looking at the kind of vouching and inclusivity there.
And I hope that answers the question that was posed. Okay, so we have another question coming through. Are there plans to make digital ID compulsory? No is the short answer to that one. In terms of, people accessing services, I think I mentioned in my presentation, we want to make them as inclusive and as accessible as possible. People will always have a choice. We know that people, for whatever reason, may not want to access public services online and or may not be able to access public services online. So we will never make digital identity compulsory. There will always be a choice, and there will always be offline routes for those who don't want to use a digital identity. Okay, so next question. Is this being integrated with the new national digital platform for health and social care as its ID service to prevent duplication? And who am I going to answer that? Was it Mike, I think, was down to answer that one?
Yep. Hi, thanks very much. My name is Mike Crocker. I'm service owner for the Digital Identity Service. I'm not putting my camera on for very good reason, because I did my back in yesterday and I'm propped up in bed, unable to move very much. So you don't need to see that. So in terms of who it's going to be used by, I mean, we're in discussions with lots and lots of different organisations, and yes, healthcare is one of those. So there is a lot of work going on at the moment around another commitment that's in the strategy, digital, and the Scottish Government strategy around enabling people to easily share their health attributes, to enable them to make appointments more easily, get test results more easily, things like that. So there's a lot of services that would be behind that digital front door, and it's thought that probably the health and social care services would sit behind that, and we are in advanced discussion with the digital front door team around what that should look like and what level of security would be required and what types of data they would want to enable individuals to be able to share. So yes, that is one of the organisations that we're looking at, but also talking to many others, including Social Security. I mean, ultimately we want this service to be the single simple way that individuals can interact with the Scottish Public Service. So there's well over 200 bodies that we know of that do that. Some of them, it's just informational stuff that they're getting from the organisation, so they might not need to go to identity verification stage. Some will be much more security needed because of the types of information that are expected to be handed over to access that service. And that's really why we have designed the service in the way that it is, with the three components, so that we can ensure that data minimisation happens in any transactions. Thanks, Trudy.
Thank you, Mike. I'm afraid we're back to you for the next question again. And the next question is, are you planning to use self-sovereign identity?
Gosh, I've always felt that if you're asking a question about blockchain, you're asking the wrong question. Self-sovereign is one way of delivering this, but the problem that we have with self-sovereign, and it may well be that it is sorted later in its development, but it's a very new technology. It does rely on a mobile device, a smartphone. And one of the difficulties that we have as being a government provider of services is that we can't choose the market that we are going to offer our services to. The services are offered to everyone, including those who don't have smartphones. So what we're trying to ensure is that the technologies that we choose to use for any of the elements that we've just shown you will work just as well on a laptop as they do on a mobile phone. Now, that's not necessarily going to be the case because of things like the quality of the camera that's on a laptop, for example. So it's why we try to point you towards using a mobile phone for taking photographs. But when we widen the service out to enable other forms of identity verification that don't need that photograph, then it's just as easy for you to answer questions that only you should know the answer to on a laptop or on a tablet. Then it's just as easy to do that as it is for a mobile phone. So inclusivity is the thing that makes it quite difficult for us to go down that self-sovereign, decentralized identity route. But we are obviously looking at all technical options and trying to make sure that the design that we have for the system enables us to potentially take components out in the future and put other components in if we find a technology that works better, but that still maintains the privacy of the individuals.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Sorry, I've just lost a bit of my chat function, so I'm just trying to get to the next question. Okay, so here we go. So the next question is, for identity verification, are you limited to UK and Scottish government issued documents and data, or can you process foreign government issued documents for users who live abroad? And I think go to Neil for that one.
Yeah, I can take that one. The quick answer is no. We can take documents issued to people abroad. The passports are in a fairly good international standard for those. One of the reasons we use an external service is they have lots of experience at identifying whether the documents are valid or not. So we're able to accept the passports currently. We do currently just accept in the UK driving licenses, but one of the changes we would expect to make in the near future is accepting European identity cards and European driving licenses as well.
Great, thank you, Neil. Okay, so the next question is, can you tell us a little bit more about the nature and purpose of digital identity service engagement with DCMS and their trust framework? And I think I will go to Gavin to answer that one. Gavin sits within our policy team and leads in our engagement with UK government. So Gavin, I don't know if you're there, able to answer the question.
Yes, hi Judy, thanks. Hi everyone, nice to speak to you all. The question is, can you tell us a little bit more about the nature and purpose of digital identity service engagement with DCMS and their trust framework? So the answer to that is we're working very closely with our colleagues in DCMS. We are, as we've said throughout the presentation, looking to work on a standards-based approach to delivering this digital identity service. There's obviously going to be a lot of overlap between the work that DCMS are doing and UK government are doing as a whole in terms of developing standards which we would adhere to. We've always said that we want to adhere to a trust framework to potentially look at the rules of the road being visible to suppliers, to participants in the service, and indeed to potentially lead to levels of interoperability between services. So it's very much an ongoing process. It's not finished at the moment. I know that the UK government's trust framework is in beta at the moment, and it's some of you on the call may well be aware that they're looking for feedback on that. So we're very much participating as part of that progress on an ongoing basis. And I think we will see more of that as the next version of that is published by the UK government into the new year. So hopefully that answers that question, Judy.
Great, thank you, Gavin. Yeah, I think the next one will be for Laurie to answer. Data losses and hacks would be extremely dangerous and sensitive if digital identities were implemented. Why do you think the benefits outweigh the risks, and what do you do to what do you do to tackle this serious risk?
Thank you. No, I think it's a fantastic question and absolutely spot on. Not just with digital identities in our particular service, but any service on the internet where digital identities prevail, and social media is awash with them. And I think the loss of identities and the data that those identities have access to is the real risk here. And absolutely for our programme, as we move into the attribute store phase, we are going to have some real challenges to overcome around, well, now that we're going to be storing information about sexual preferences or health or whatever it is that the attributes that the end users want to put into their lockers. How do we protect those? What I would say first of all is that right now, if you're interacting with 5 or 6 or 100 government agencies for different things, so social security for benefits, or historic and environment Scotland for a visitor pass to Edinburgh Castle, you're probably going to have a login with every individual government entity, and that means you're going to have upwards of a dozen passwords and user IDs that you're going to have to remember or write down or use the same passwords. People will do what will take the path of least resistance in order to access these services. So one of the benefits of our programme is that you have a single identity. And if we ever do get a drive to move to passwordless, then you would have no password, but you have one identity to look after. And as the front line of defence in terms of cybersecurity, we can help you with some awareness programmes on how to protect that identity. But equally, one of the other things that we'll do from the other side of it will be to help to keep you and your account and your identities and data safe. We'll provide some kind of fraud protection services in the same way that banks do, just to help you to stay safe online. And it's easier to do that, and it's cheaper for government to do that if there's one identity service to manage rather than one per public sector body. So hopefully that answers that question partially.
Great, thank you, Laurie. Next question is, how can I, as an organisation, be part of your beta? I think the answer is fairly simple. Come and talk to us. We want to speak to as many service customers as possible. If you're interested in our service, if you think you have a need for what we're developing, come and talk to us, and we can explore what might be possible. We have a couple of people with us today, Tom and David, who lead our service customer engagement team. I don't know if Tom or David, do you want to add anything into that?
Am I on sound? Yes. Thank you, Trudy. Absolutely, as you say, we would be delighted to hear from as many organisations as possible. We're obviously speaking to a wide range as it is to understand both the needs of those organisations and also, more importantly, the needs of the people who use the services that those organisations provide. So if you haven't already heard from us or spoken to us, please get in touch. I know that Hannah and the team will be sharing contact details after the event, and absolutely get in touch so that we can speak to you about what needs that you and your users may have. So yes, thanks, Trudy.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, next one. Are there plans to link a digital wallet to this digital identity? And I think I'm probably going to Mike to answer that one.
Yep, very simple answer to that. Yes, absolutely. But with the proviso that by what we mean by digital wallet is not just a wallet on your mobile phone. Going back to the inclusivity, which is an easy word to say, issue that I talked about before, we don't want to restrict people's ability to use this service to only those who have smartphones. And I'll answer one of the other questions that's coming up straight away as I mentioned that. Yes, you will need a smartphone initially because of the MVP, the minimum viable product that we're using for the sign-on. But the next thing that we are proposing to do is to open that out to the ability to get your one-time passcode via a landline. Because we do realise that not everyone even has a mobile phone, never mind a smartphone. And we want to ensure that people who don't have or who don't have particularly good mobile reception where they live or work, that this doesn't stop them from being able to access the service. So yes, to a locker of some sort, and we're looking at a lot of different options for that, but it needs to be a privacy protecting locker that encrypts things, that keeps things separate from other people's data, and that is accessible by those who don't have a smartphone. So not quite the straightforward yes or no, but broadly yes.
Great, thank you, Mike. Okay, so the next question I have here is, can professional bodies such as solicitors or agents register a single account to use the system for all their users? I think I'm probably going to Neil or Francis to answer that one.
And I missed the question because I was typing in something else. Sorry, could you repeat that one, Trudy?
I'll repeat it, of course, Neil, of course. Can professional bodies such as solicitors or agents register a single account to use the system for all their users?
No. The use of the account is meant to be on a per person basis. So there's nothing to stop organizations using accounts for whatever purpose they want, but we would like it to be a one account as an individual. I'd just add to that though as well that there's nothing to stop users having more than one account on the service. If people want to have one account for their professional interactions with something and another for personal, or if they want to have separate accounts for interacting with each individual service, we are perfectly happy for people to do that if they want to make sure they have more rigid enforcement of between services.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Next question is, will this service replace the MyGov Scot My Account? If yes, what are the timescales? So I think it's important to say that, I think I mentioned it during my presentation, is that the digital strategy for Scotland, where the commitment to develop a common approach to digital identity was made, is a joint strategy between local government and the Scottish Government. So obviously, you know, that has implications for you know, existing services, and we're working closely, you know, with local government to really kind of understand and unpick what that might mean, and develop a strategy together to look at how we achieve the commitment within the digital strategy. Okay, next question. Are there levels of verification, for example, for a high value financial or land transaction? Is there a higher level of assurance? I think probably I'm maybe going back to you, Neil, for that one.
So not at launch. At launch, we are concentrating on getting the medium good practice guide standard, a level of confidence. That doesn't mean that we won't add the option at a later point, and we would be keen to hear from people who think they require a kind of a higher level, so that we can build that into our plans for longer term.
Okay, thank you.
The one thing to add to that, of course, is that sorry to jump in, Trudy, that the way that we've designed the service, if your service doesn't need identity verification to any level, then it doesn't need to have it. You could still just use the secure sign-on. So that's a kind of very low level of trust, but perfectly good if all you're looking to do is, you know, have a save and resume functionality, for example, in your application for your service. But at the point at which you are going to need to identify someone, in general, there's not a huge difference between low and medium, so we've plumped for medium. And to be frank, getting to high is very difficult and will probably involve some sort of face-to-face interaction that you would want to do. Now, in that circumstance, if you're a service that requires a high level, then perhaps we could get the individual to a medium level and then only leave a small amount of things that you would need to do to uplift that to a high level. So it's still worthwhile going through the medium, even if you need a high. But I think we'd want to discuss with you why you think you would need a high level of assurance.
Thank you both. Okay, the next question I think is probably for David. If the service goes down or is compromised, what are the resilience features?
Thanks, Trudy. Yeah, I suppose we always plan for the worst and hope for the best, in the sense that we hope that the controls that are put in place around using a scalable and resilient cloud platform means that we don't need to consider these issues, but we also have to plan for them, because as we've seen only this week, high volumes on services can can create issues for us. However, that's where our highly skilled IT support team comes in, who are able to sort of crank additional wheels to get things coming back up. Similarly, with the ability of using backups, we look to minimise and eliminate anything like data loss. So the service, when it's reinstated, is the service that it was when it fell over, to make sure that we can protect users' data and make sure that the service is down for as little time as possible when we have those types of spikes.
Okay, great, thank you, David. The next question is, who will decide if this digital identity is an ethical move, and how much consideration will the views of the public be given in this decision? I think I mentioned in my presentation that engaging with the public, undertaking user research is obviously a key part of the work. We've been developing our approach to digital identity for a few years now, and we've deliberately taken a very sort of thoughtful and deliberative approach to make sure that we are doing the right thing. There's been lots of stakeholder engagement, lots of engagement with the public on various aspects as we've developed the service as it is today. As I said, I mentioned the public engagement programme that we currently have underway. I think it is in recognition that there's a lot of sensitivities around digital identity and making sure that people have choice and complete control over anything that will be done. I'll just see whether Joe wants to just say a little bit more about the public engagement work that we've currently got underway just now.
Yeah, can do. So we've been working with an organisation called Britain Thinks to listen and work with members of the public about through a deliberative process where they hear about the digital identity programme, about use of access to public services, about how they use data. And we are working with people with different levels of trust in government, people who experience lots of different services and face barriers to being able to use services, to take them through a deliberative process where they don't just hear about the digital identity programme itself, but also about concerns people have with the digital identity programme from all sides, so we can help them to understand and help them to inform us about what we should be thinking about when we look to the next stages of the service and how we develop it. So it's very kind of wide remit we're looking at, and we're going to be looking forward to publishing the recommendations of that group and the findings in the first few months of 2023.
Yeah, great, thank you, Joe. It's a really, really important piece of work, and as the person who asked the question highlights, engaging with the public is so important, because ultimately we want people to trust and have confidence in the service. So thank you. Okay, so the next question is, who provides the underlying technology for capturing and verification of ID documentation? Does Experian do this as well as the address verification? I mean, I can go to Neil to answer this question, but the answer is yes. But Neil, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
I was busy typing in other answers again, so I missed it. I'll start paying more attention. Sorry, which one was that?
It's asking who provides the underlying technology for capturing and verifying ID documentation. Is Experian? So yes. Yeah. So
at the moment, it's Experian. And there is another component for the kind of the verification that's done by MyTech. The way we've built it though is we're building in a kind of component fashion so that we can change if we need to. We can use data from different sources, and the longer term ambition is that we're aiming for less and less reliance on external or private sources of data. Just again, to kind of like a privacy point of view, but at launch, Experian, use of Experian data sources, but with the idea that we will supplement them or swap them out for different ones as soon as feasible.
I think, sorry to butt in again, but I think there's one thing that's worthwhile adding to that, in that although we are using Experian to do the kind of capture, and Experian and Mitek to do the capture of the selfie, to do the scan of the document, we have been very clear in the contract that we've entered into with Experian that they are not going to keep those details. This is not creating an account with Experian. Experian will do the check, will give us information back, and then the vast majority of information that they had gleaned from scanning the passport or anything else is destroyed. And they do not, for example, hold on to the biometric information for any length of time at all, because that was one of the things, you know, we are mindful of the types of things that came up when the COVID passport, for example, came in. And it was a very similar process, albeit done by a different company called Jumio, that people went through to access their COVID certification. And so we've been very clear to take the learnings from that and make sure that Experian and Mitek don't hold on to any information that they don't require, and that includes the photograph and biometrics. So in exactly the same way as we are minimising the data that the organisations are asking for, we are minimising the data that is being held onto by any of our processors of data. We want the place where data is held to be ultimately the attribute store, which will be under the control of and driven by consent of the individual. And that's the core principle of what we're designing here.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we might be coming back to you, Mike, for the next one, or maybe Laurie. But we can start with you, Mike, and Laurie can chip in if he thinks he's got something to add. So, what assurance can you provide that digital ID would not threaten the right to privacy? Will the development of digital ID linked databases of personal activity be forbidden?
Yes, it will. I mean, one of the things, I mean, perhaps I perhaps nod towards Laurie for this, because he knows a bit more about the kind of technical background of what we're doing about encrypting data and such like. But whilst there are identifiers in this, because otherwise organisations don't know who you are. I mean, we've tried to make the sign-on as anonymous as possible. So, for example, you could put that your email address is donaldduck@hotmail.com if you want, and you're okay. You have to put in a mobile phone number or longer term, perhaps landline number, but it's not, you know, distinct personal information that you're entering into to create your sign-on. So when you sign on to an organisation, they need to know who you are. Otherwise, they are going to have to every time you try to access the service, say, "All right, donaldduck@hotmail.com, but what's your real name?" Now, if we when we are making the account for the first time, we will generate an identity number that is given to the service customer, so that they know every time you come back, Donald Duck, they can look up their own personal files and say, John Smith, hello again. Thanks very much. We can continue with your application. But it is very much trying to minimise that data flow. And Laura, I don't know if you want to say more about the security side of how we ensure that those blocks are in place to stop the ability of data to be tracked across the public sector more generally.
Yeah, so certainly on our services perspective, we are forbidding the development of digital ID linked databases. So that's not something we're doing. There was early in the programme, one of the architectural decisions that we had to take around the whole mechanism of encryption and how it would support attribute stores that lead us down a path of we have to create a database here to make it work, because at some point we're going to need to decrypt this information so we know who it is that we need to tell them that they've got an update to an attribute. I'll not bore you too much with the complications of it, but within the Scottish Government, we have a published set of identity management and privacy principles, and one of those principles does mandate that we will not create databases of this nature. We're forbidden from doing so, and it's not something that we're going to do as a service. What I can't speak on behalf of is the other public sector bodies who may have a legitimate lawful basis in order to use the information that you're providing with them through our service in order to use that data for as you say, a digital ID linked purposes. We wouldn't know what they were. They would have to justify those that processing themselves. But from our perspective, we're not doing it at all. So.
Thank you both. That's a pretty clear answer. Thank you. Oh, someone coming in there?
Yeah, so just to come in there, there's another question about kind of will individuals be able to have more than one digital identity that I think is relevant here as well, in that we are perfectly fine with people having multiple accounts, multiple identities. So if people really want to make sure that particular bits of information are kept separate or secure or can't be linked, then by all means, they can have a separate account for that. You would lose some of the benefits of being able to share certain information that was verified elsewhere, but there is choice there.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question I think might be for Tom and maybe David Duncan Fraser. So the question is, this could involve significant change to systems processes for service customers. Is support available to introduce it and to train?
I'll pick up there first of all. Yeah, obviously, if we'll get in touch with us through our usual channels, what we ought to do is to work with service customers to understand where in the system that digital identity could plug in. That might involve a considerable amount of change, and we're happy to speak to people to work through that. Until we know the levels of that, though, that it's very difficult to provide a concrete answer other than please speak to us, and we're happy to engage.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, this is probably something that we'll learn as we go, as we start to onboard service customers. You know, some service customers might have common requirements, whereas other service customers might have unique requirements. It's very much a, you know, in a discussion we'll find that out. And obviously, you know, working with Disclosure Scotland, we're learning a lot about what support. You know, they will need to take them through this journey, and we can use that learning as we start to onboard further service customers. Okay, let's go to the next question here on the list. Will the private sector be able to access the service for reasons of, for example, age verification for purchase of alcohol? I'm not sure who I'm going to answer that one. Perhaps Mike?
Yeah, I was about to volunteer.
Yeah,
I mean, the answer right now is no. This is not what we have designed the system for. It is not what the commitment in the digital strategy was about. This is about the efficient or more efficient delivery of public services. So those public services potentially could be being delivered by a private body. So you know, in certain healthcare areas, for example, or it could be being delivered by a charity or third sector body. So, you know, we're drawing the line. We're not drawing the line and saying if you're not part of Scottish Government, you can't use this. But we are drawing the line at saying this is a public sector usage for this. Now, the complication comes from the fact that, yes, we look to be part of a trust framework, which is looking to extend to private sector use. So what is being done in DCMS at the moment, for example, is certifying bodies to be able to verify attributes on behalf of private sector organisations for things like right to work, for example. So there is work going on in that space, and by making sure that we adhere to that trust framework and are a standards-based system, then there is no reason why in the future it couldn't. But there are all sorts of difficult questions that we would need to then ask about how that information flows and who pays for it. because the last thing that we want to do is to commercialise people's personal data. And although they wouldn't be paying to access their own data, ultimately the charge in the private sector service would go up to be able to access this and would be passed on. So it becomes a very complex argument, which is why we have right at the start said, no, this is public sector, where we are an ecosystem that has lots of public sector organisations who can trust each other about what they do with the data and how they access the data, and that's our focus for the meantime.
Great, thank you, Mike. Just to say to everyone, we're starting to near the end of the Q&A session, so we'll probably be closing down the Q&A in about 5 minutes or so, just because we've still got loads of questions to ask. But please, if you have, if you've got questions they haven't been answered yet, please pop them down in the Q&A. As I say, we'll close it in 5 minutes, so you've got some time to jot down your questions. As I said earlier, any that we're not able to answer today, we'll publish answers to those kind of on our blog after the event. And indeed, if there's anything that's come up and you want to talk to one of the team about, you know, please just get in touch. Okie dokie. So next question is around passwords and data breaches. So I think it might be for Laurie. And the question is, passwords are the #1 cause of data breach. How will you prevent breached and exposed passwords being used during registration and thereafter?
So this is one of the questions where there's a balance of usability by default and design. So absolutely, if anybody types their email address into "have I been pawned," and I would recommend everyone does that, you'll maybe be horrified at how many times your email account has been breached. And if you're using the same password for multiple services, then you might want to consider changing that. So from our perspective, NCSC have published from that "have I been pawned" data set the top 100,000 passwords that have been breached and compromised. Now, yes, it would be easy for us to just take that list off the shelf, plug it in and say you can't use these 100,000 passwords. But user research would probably suggest that a vast majority of people will hit those passwords, and repeatedly hitting variations of those passwords and get extremely frustrated, and at some point they might just stop and give up. So for me, absolutely, we need to plug in some kind of capability to the service where we are preventing the obvious bad passwords or the most breached passwords. But whether we stretch as far as all 100,000 of them, I think needs to be balanced with some user research to determine how intrusive we're actually being there. But we will be absolutely deploying some kind of capability in that space.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. I think the next question might be for Neil. And the question is, how will the locker handle a validity period for items used to verify identity if the source document, such as passport, has expired?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few complexities around about that. Is that part of what we do with an identity verification process is we say that we are verifying that that person is the owner of that identity, and then we are relying on the security of the account and the multi-factor authentication to say that that person is still the same person that went through the identity verification process. So I think if you verify your identity today and your passport expires tomorrow, you can still be confident that that person was verified as that person at the time. So there is some consistency there anyway. There's a more general question around about validity. We will have a rough standard we use for how long we think is appropriate, but a lot of that will still come down to business decisions about how confident they are at certain points and when they want to request refreshes. So for a lot of organizations, if the identity hasn't been verified in the last year, they might want to consider that they request a kind of a fresh identity. For others, if you verified somebody's identity 5 years ago, but you have been consistently interacting with that person in the meantime, then you don't necessarily need to verify that person's identity or request verification of identity unless something is changing or there's something kind of escalating there. Is there anything you'd add to that, Mike? Does that, I've gone slightly vague on that answer, possibly.
No, I think that's it exactly. I mean, it's really horses for courses, but you know, it depends on the service, the security, what the individual is trying to do. If it's out of the ordinary, then you know, perhaps we want to you know, just do a little bit of a refresh, you know, and make sure that there is still a person of that name at that address, for example. But that has to be figured out in collaboration with services and figure out what level of security and what level of risk they're willing to live with.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add as well, we are looking at ways of refreshing people's identity without having to put them through the full identity verification process as well. So if there is just kind of a recent document or a recent check that there hasn't been any fraud associated with that identity, we're looking at kind of ways we can lighten the load when we do need to do that in the update there.
Thank you both. I think next one's probably for Gavin, and it's not really something we've touched on an awful lot today, so it's probably worth fitting this one in. And the question is, how will the service align with gov.uk provided services where people will be using separate identity verification platforms and processes? Will it confuse users who will need to learn which services are through this and which are through gov.uk and providing the same information multiple times?
Okay, great. Thanks, Judy. It's a good question and one we expected to come up. I would say it's an ongoing issue and something we're definitely working through. So we're delivering on a commitment of Scotland's digital strategy to establish a trusted and secure service for people to prove who they are to access digital public services. But both our service and the GDS One login service are in their early stages. We're working with UK government on potential scope for interoperability to ensure that we do get the best outcome for people accessing those digital public services. As I mentioned earlier, we're engaged in the development of the trust framework for digital identities with DCMS and also very much interested in the development of One login product by GDS. And we're in discussions with our colleagues in UK government on how to align the services, and those discussions are ongoing. And really to answer that question, we very much wish to avoid confusing users when we're accessing services. And just maybe to expand briefly, by interoperability, we mean potentially enabling users to use their verified Scottish digital identity to perhaps access UK services without having to go through a separate identity verification process, and vice versa. And that's something we'd very much like to explore to ensure we get the best access to public services for people in Scotland, but it is as yet an unanswered question which we are working through but very much aware of. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. Okay, there's I think a question for Joe, and it's a bit, it kind of expands on something that both Joe and I spoke about earlier. And someone has asked, who is Britain Thinks? So Joe, I don't know if you're able to answer the question about who is Britain Thinks.
Yeah, Britain Thinks is an independent research company who were procured by the service to do some work with potential users of the service to investigate it. So they're working with us, but ultimately that research is going to be independent of government, and the suggestions that come back are going to be separate from our own point of view. So they're an organisation that is involved in qualitative research. Answer.
Thank you, Joe. So just to let you know that we've now sort of closed the Q&A session. We've still got so many questions still to answer. So yeah, we'll commit to answering those and providing an update following the event. There's so many questions have been asked, and you know, it's been a fantastic discussion. So just to thank you all for your input and contribution, and for asking lots of, you know, really thoughtful and interesting questions. And although that we have the Q&A has now been closed, if there's anyone has any further questions or want to chat, just just please get in touch. As I say, we've put our contact details in the slides, and all of the contact information will be available on the blog. And just finally, thank you to all for coming. Thank you to the team for all the effort in delivering the event today, both the people that have been working behind the scenes, but also our presenters who have done a fantastic job in updating you on the progress that we're making to get the Digital Identity Service live early next year. As I said at the start, we'll be sending out a post-event form, so please complete that. We're keen to hear your feedback, both on this session and indeed, we've touched on a whole range of topics in the Q&A. So if there's any further events that you would like to see, any further discussions or themes, please get in touch and let us know. And as we say on the slide here, it's you can follow us on Twitter, sign up to our newsletter, and there's the email address for you if you want to get in touch. So just want to thank you all again, and with that, we'll close the event and we'll hope to see you all soon. Thank you.